So, a very good evening to one and all present here. So, in the last lecture, we had an introduction about the biodiversity and what are different kinds of species that are present, how many of them may be insects, how most of them are insects, how many of them are amphibians, how many of them are vertebrates, invertebrates. So, we had an estimate of that. So, in today's lecture, we will learn more about the biodiversity and the patterns of the biodiversity. So, starting with the patterns of biodiversity. So, what actually is the biodiversity pattern in a species? So, biodiversity pattern in species is basically related to the understanding that the number of species which are found on the surface of the earth varies globally, locally, as well as with the time. So, these are that the species which are present today are not constant and have evolved as a course of evolution during the different stages of the evolution. So many variations may be present within the species, biomes, ecosystem, and of a particular area. So several biodiversity patterns can occur within various species, communities, regions, habitats, biomes, ecosystem, and the entire earth. The ecologists studied the biodiversity in the environment and by studying the by studying the biodiversity which is present in the environment, they observed a regular pattern in which the diversity is actually distributed over the entire area of the earth. So the distribution of the biodiversity also depends on the various factors, the availability of the suitable conditions that allows them to survive in that particular environment. So therefore, the pattern of biodiversity, or we can say that the biodiversity may vary depending on the space or with the time. So Charles Robert Darwin, who is a who described three different patterns and levels of biodiversity. So according to Charles Darwin, there are following three patterns of the biodiversity. The first is the global patterns of the biodiversity. Second is species vary locally. And third is species vary over the time. So in today's lecture, we will basically learn about these different patterns of biodiversity one by one. So starting with what is firstly the global patterns of biodiversity. So global, as the term denote, means the entire globe or the entire earth. So basically in this pattern of biodiversity, species living the similar ecosystems, that is the ecosystems that have the similar conditions, but the location of the ecosystem is in different parts. So therefore, in this pattern of biodiversity, the species that live in the similar ecosystem, but in different parts of the world, make them distantly related as they act and look quite similar. Because of the similarities in their surroundings, the species adapt in such a way that they tend to look similar and they tend to act similar. Therefore, they might be considered distantly related. So they look and act similarly. For example, the emus which are found in the Australia, the rheas which are found in South America, and the ostriches that are found in the Africa. So all of these three birds are basically found in the different parts of the world, but due to the similarities in their ecosystem, they have adapted or they have evolved in a way that they act or they look similar to each other. So all of these three birds, which I mentioned here, the emus in the Australia, rheas that are found in the South America, ostriches that are found in Africa, they all are flightless birds. So despite being the differences in the area in which they are present, the similarities in the ecosystem have um, provide them with the capacity to look or act similarly. The second pattern of biodiversity is the local variation. So species vary locally. So in this pattern of biodiversity, animal species often occupy different habitats within a local area. So within the same local area, different animal species occupy different habitats. For example, if I talk about the Galapagos Island, Charles Darwin has talked a lot about these. So these Galapagos Islands are a group of islands relatively close to each other, but having different climates. So this is a group of islands that are relatively close to each other, but these islands have different climatic conditions as compared to each other. So Darwin observed the differences in the ecological conditions of the islands along with the differences in the shape, cell shape of the tortoise. So basically he tries to relate the ecological condition with the morphological features of the tortoises that are present on these islands. So basically what we are trying to say here is that despite being the like due to the changes or due to the differences in the environmental conditions, despite being the presence in a local area, the species may occupy different habitats, and the differences in those habitats may lead to the differences in the biodiversity pattern of the animal species. So, for example, as we see in this condition, the Galapagos Island, which is actually a group of many small islands that are relatively close, that are very close to each other, but all of these islands have different climatic conditions. So, based on these, Darwin observed the differences in the ecological conditions of the islands along with the differences in the shell shape of the tortoises. The next example is Isabella Island that contains high peaks, higher rainfall, and contains rich vegetation. The tortoise of this island, if I compare with the other islands, for example, the Hood Island, so the tortoise that are present on this island has a short neck and they have a dome-shaped shell on the basis of the requirement that they require based on the environmental conditions like high peaks, higher rainfall, and higher vegetation. While the tortoise species that are present on the Hood Island has comparatively lower, is present on the lower elevations, very much with a dry climate and contains less vegetation as compared to the Isabella Island. So the tortoise which are present on these island or on this Hood Island have a long neck, saddle-backed shell as compared to the short neck and dome-shaped shell tortoises that are present on the Isabella Island. So Darwin also observed that different islands contain different varieties of mockingbirds. So basically here, the main point to understand is that the differences in the within a similar local area, the differences in the habitat which an organism or an animal species occupy may lead to the differences in the species. So leading to the pattern of biodiversity may also vary, the species may also vary locally depending on the local environmental conditions of its habitat. The third point that I mentioned was that species vary over time. So we know that from the time of evolution, there are many species that have evolved continuously with time. So through the studies of fossils, it was found that some were enormous versions of modern day species. For example, the modern day armadillos, which are just 50 centimeter long, or we can say 0.5 meter, while the fossil remains of the armadillos that resemble the modern day armadillos is approximately 3 meter long, suggesting that the earlier versions were the enormous version of modern day species. So suggest so this is an example that signifies that how the species may vary over the time. So depending on the requirements, depending on the adaptations that a particular species and the accumulation of these variations over a large period of time, ultimately there is an evolution. During the course of evolution, there is an new species evolve. And we found that species do vary over the time. For example, most of the species, like in case of armadillos, when we study the fossils of the armadillos that resemble the modern day armadillos is enormous version of what we see in the today's period. So example, as I mentioned, so the modern day armadillos are just 0.5 meter long, while their fossils while the fossil remains of the Gilpodont, which is a which resembles the modern day armadillos, is 3 meter long. So this is how these are the three different patterns of the biodiversity. So the species the biodiversity pattern may be described spatially, that is within the space, and how the changes in the space leads to the patterns in the biodiversity. So we know that throughout the world, if I talk, the biodiversity is not uniform. The biodiversity varies with the changes in the latitude and altitude, and also with the time. So there is different patterns, spatial and temporal. Spatial means with the space, temporal means along the time. So basically, it is the most well-defined pattern of biodiversity, which is the spatial pattern of biodiversity. So spatial patterns describe the patterns of biodiversity in space, and two patterns are defined in which the diversity varies with the space changes. And these two patterns are patterns of biodiversity latitudinal along the latitudinal gradient, and the next is the species area relationship, that how the area in which the species are present, what is the relationship between the number of species that may be present in that particular area. So, firstly, we will learn about the patterns of biodiversity latitudinal gradients, or how the changes in the latitudes or height affect the changes in the species diversity or leads to the species diversity. So, species diversity is maximum near the equator. So if we know that equator is the center line, and then we have tropical regions, and in the last we have temperate, tropical, and then we have tropical, temperates, and then in the last we have polar areas. So as I start moving, or as we move towards from the equator towards the pole, we found that the species diversity is maximum near the equator, while as we move towards the pole, the species diversity keeps on decreasing. So this suggests that the biodiversity is more at lower altitudes or the lower latitudes near the equator, and less at higher latitudes near the poles. There might be some exceptions, although to few species. So with very few exceptions, tropics, which are the latitudinal range of 23.5 degree north to 23.5 degrees south, that is the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn, these harbor more species than the temperate or the polar areas. So there are certain, except few species, most of the species, as we know or as we found, are present in the tropical areas. Colombia, which is located near the equator, has nearly 14,000 species of birds, while New York at 41 degree north has just 105 species, while Greenland at 71 degree north has only 56 species. So as we move, or there is a change in the latitude, we found that there is a changes in the species diversity, and the more it is close to the equator, except few species, more is the species diversity near the equator. And India, with much of its land area is in the tropical latitude, has more than 1,200 species of birds. So India is much of its areas in the tropical latitudes, and it is a homeland for more than 1,200 species of the bird. India, located in a tropical territory, has very good species richness, as we see that it has around approximately 1,200 species of the birds. Amazon rainforest have maximum biological diversity with regard to the number of species inhabiting this region. So Amazon rainforest is highly rich in species, and it has a maximum biological diversity with regard to the number of species that inhabit this region. The tropics latitudinal range of 23.5 degree north to 23, that is the Tropic of Cancer and tropic. So one question that obviously arises in our mind, that should arise in our mind, is that why these tropical regions have a higher diversity as compared to the temperate regions or the polar regions. So one of the reasons that we may attribute to the high species richness or the high biological diversity in the tropical region is the less changes in the climatic conditions. So the tropics have firm climate conditions in contrast to the temperate areas. So species do not need to keep adapting to a changing season. So we can see enriched species diversity in this region. Unlike temperate areas which are subject to regular glaciations in the past, tropical latitudes have remained quite intact for millions of years and thus got a long evolution time for species diversification. So these are some of the factors. Like the most important thing is that in case of tropical regions, the tropical regions have a higher species diversity as compared to temperate or the polar regions. So one of the reasons that may be attributed is the firm climatic conditions. And due to these firm climatic conditions, the species need not to change or adapt themselves frequently, and therefore therefore we can see enriched species diversity in this region. Also, like in the past, it has been seen that unlike the temperate areas which are subject to regular glaciations in the past, tropical latitudes have remained quite intact for millions of years and thus got a long evolution time for species diversification, leading to the more species formation and higher biodiversity or higher species richness in the tropical area. The next is the species area relationship. So the relationship between the species richness and the area was described by a German naturalist and geographer Alexander von Humboldt. And during his pioneering and extensive explorations in the wilderness of South American jungles, he observed that within a region, species richness increased with increasing explored area, but only up to a limit. It's not like that we keep on increasing the area, the species richness keep on increasing. There will be a time that when you will keep on increasing the area, but the species, the number of species that you have observed till now will remain the same. So, in fact, the relation between the species richness and area for a wide variety of taxa like angiosperms, plants, birds, bats, freshwater fishes turns out to be a rectangular hyperbola. So, this is the curve which we obtain when we try to uh, find the relation between the species richness and the area. So, it is a rectangular hyperbola. So it was observed, this is one of the important questions, that who observed or who gave the relationship between the species area, between the species richness and the area. So the species area relationship was given by Alexander von Humboldt. And he observed that with the increase in the, like when he was exploring the South American jungles, he found that within a region, species richness increased with increasing explored area, but only up to a limit. So there is a limit to this, and when we try to draw the species richness along versus the area curve, we will find that the curve is a rectangular hyperbola. So if I try to convert it on a log scale and want try to on a logarithmic scale, if I convert this equation, it will be a straight line equation that may be defined as log S is equal to log C plus Z log A. So S is actually, so this will be a straight line between the species richness and area. So if we are talk about the species richness and area relationship, so it is a straight line relationship if we are talking on a logarithmic scale, but if in general it is a rectangular hyperbola. So the relationship is a straight line described by the equation. So log S is equal to log C plus Z log A. So S is here the species richness in an area. A is the area. Z is the slope of the line, regression coefficient, and Y is the intercept. So this is the species area relationship, which was given by Alexander von Humboldt. I'm again repeating it in short that according to the species area relationship, which was described by Alexander von Humboldt, it was found that the species richness in a particular area increases with the increase in the area explored, but only up to a limit. In fact, the relationship between the species richness and area for a wide variety of taxa, that is the angiosperms, plants, birds, bats, freshwater fishes, turns out to be a rectangular hyperbola. So on a logarithmic scale, the relationship is a straight line, which is described by the equation log S is equal to log C plus Z log A, where S is the species richness, A is the area, Z is the slope of the line, or we can say it is the regression coefficient, and Y is the intercept. So it's just Y is equal to mx plus C. So it is a straight line equation, and we can find that if we are talk about the species richness and the area relationship on a log scale or on a logarithmic scale, it will be a straight line equation, but in general it is a rectangular hyperbola. So ecologists have discovered, various ecologists have actually tried to calculate the value of Z to know about the species richness relationship with the area. So ecologists have discovered that the value of Z actually lies in the range of 0.1 to 0.2, regardless of the taxonomic group or the region, whether it is plants in Britain, birds in California, or mollusks in New York State. The slope of regression line is actually very similar, irrespective of the species or the taxonomic group of which we are talking about, or the region in which these species or the taxonomic group organisms exist. So, but if we analyze the species area relationship among the very large areas like the entire continent, we will find that the slope of the line is much steeper, and it is equal to, its value may range from 0.6 to 1.2. So its value increases from 0.1 to 0.2 to 0.6 to 0.6 to 1.2. For example, if I talk, in case this increment is in case of the, if I talk about the species area relationship among the very large areas like the entire continent. So for example, for frugivorous, that is the fruit eating birds. So frugivorous are the fruit eating birds and the mammals in the tropical forest of different continents. The slope is found to be 1.15, which is near to 1.2. So if the value of Z actually depends on the area also of which we are talking about. So if we talk about smaller areas, then irrespective or regardless of the taxonomic group or the region, the value of Z usually lies between the range of 0.1 to 0.2. But if we analyze the species area relationship among the very large areas like the entire continents, we'll find that the slope of the line to be much steeper, and the Z value lies in the range of 0.6 to 1.2. So an example has been given for frugivorous birds, where that is the fruit-eating birds and the mammals, where the fruit-eating birds and the mammals in the tropical forest of different continents, the slope or the value of the Z is found to be 1.15. So this was about the special patterns of the biodiversity, or the special patterns of biodiversity, that includes the pattern of biodiversity, the latitudinal gradients, and the species area relationship. The next is the biodiversity patterns in time, that how along with the time there's different biodiversity patterns that were observed. So first is the seasonal pattern. So there are three different types of recognized patterns in time, and the first one is the seasonal pattern. So we know that during different seasons, the diversity of the species varies. In the rainy season, the diversity of insect species increases and it decreases during the winters. Similarly, the bird diversity is related to the migratory activity and the breeding season. So based on the season, the diversity may vary for some of these species, and during different seasons, the diversity of the species varies. For example, the number of insects of the species of the insects, the diversity of insect species increases in the rainy season and decreases in the winter season. The next is the successional pattern. So after a succession, we know that after a disturbance, there is a development of that ecosystem again. So which is the succession. So after a disturbance, plants and animal species begin to reoccupy the habitat. They grow and replaced by other species. So this pattern of the temporal shift in the species composition of a community is called the succession. This we have studied in the last lectures also, that what is succession. The pattern of the temporal shift in the species composition of a community is called the succession. And during the succession, after the disturbance, when any plant or animal species begin to reoccupy the habitat, these plants and animal species grow and get replaced by the other species, and ultimately leading to the climax communities which are in well equilibrium with the current habitat. The third is the evolutionary pattern. So first is seasonal, the second is due to succession, the third is due to evolution. So we know that over 600 millions of years of evolution, increasing biodiversity has been found over each regime and era. Some animals have actually become extinct, while some are still found as living fossils, and some are represented as missing links or existing links in the history of evolution. So this is how the biodiversity or the species diverse during the course of evolution in the time. So for many decades, now what is the importance of such species diversity? Do we actually require these much of species, or what will be the impact if we will lose some of these species? Will the loss of these species or some of these species will actually hamper the growth, or will actually hamper the survival, or will it be okay even if we will lose some of the species? So this we will learn in the next subsequent slides, that what is the importance of species diversity, what is the importance of conserving these species, what is the importance of maintaining this biodiversity in the ecosystem. So for many decades, ecologists believed that the communities with more species generally tend to be more stable than those with the less species. However, a stable community should not show too much variation in productivity from year to year. It must be either resistant or resilient to occasional disturbances. For example, these occasional disturbances may be natural or man-made, and it must also be resistant to invasion by the alien species. So this is a definition of stable community. So for many years, ecologists tend to believe that more the number of species in any particular area, or the communities with more species generally are more stable than those with the less species. So stable community should not show too much variation in productivity from year to year. It must be either resistant or resilient to the occasional disturbances that may be natural or man-made, and it must be resistant to the invasion by the alien species also. David Tillman, who is a long-term who is an ecologist, in his long-term ecosystem experiments using outdoor plots, provide some answers to the linkage of these attributes like the productivity and the ability to resist the occasional disturbances with the species richness. And Tillman found that the plots with more species showed less year-to-year variation in the total biomass. He also showed in his experiment that increased diversity contributed to the higher productivity. So basically, Tillman tries to understand the importance of the species diversity, and he found that in some of his experiments using the outdoor plots, he found the linkage of these attributes with the species richness. And he found that the species with more, like the plots with more species, showed less year-to-year variation in total biomass. He also showed that in his experiments, increased diversity contributed to the higher productivity, thereby suggesting that the biodiversity has an important role in the development of any community, and also in a higher productivity of the ecosystem. Although we may not completely understand that how the species richness contributes to the well-being of an ecosystem, but we know enough to realize that rich biodiversity is not only essential for ecosystem health, but imperative for the very survival of the human race on this planet. So it is really important to preserve this rich biodiversity. Otherwise, it's not like that the loss of any particular species will not have an impact on us. But in reality, we know that each and every species are actually interrelated, or we know that are interdependent on each other. Therefore, the loss in the species richness or the richness of the biodiversity may is not only essential for the health of the ecosystem, but is very important for the survival of the human race on this planet. So there are no direct answers to uh, answer the question that why or how this rich diversity actually helps, but we can try to understand the importance of this biodiversity richness or the species richness through a by making through an analogy by the Rivet Popper hypothesis, which was used by the Stanford ecologist Paul Eldridge. Paul Eldridge is a very famous ecologist from the Stanford, and he has used an analogy, the Rivet Popper hypothesis. So he has considered ecosystem as an aeroplane or the airplane, and the species as the rivets. So in an airplane ecosystem, all parts are joined together using thousands of rivets, which are the species. So we know that in an ecosystem that all the species are actually interconnected. And if every passenger traveling in it starts popping a rivet to take home, causing a species to become extinct, it may not affect flight safety, proper functioning of the ecosystem initially, but as more and more rivets are removed, the plane becomes dangerously weak over a period of time. So initially, we may not realize that the loss in a species, in loss in one species, may lead is actually impacting the entire ecosystem. But as more and more species start becoming extinct, or as more and more species start coming into the threatened zone, the plane, or we can say the ecosystem, becomes dangerously weak over the period of time. Furthermore, we do not know that which species or the which rivet in case of airplane is very crucial, and the removal of this rivet or the species from the ecosystem may lead to the ultimate damage to the ecosystem. So the loss of the rivets on the wings, for example, which is very crucial and obviously important, and the more serious threat to the flight safety than loss of a few rivets on the seats and the windows inside the plane. So therefore, the key species or the keystone species that drives the major ecosystem functions in an ecosystem are considered to be the very important rivets that, and the loss of these rivets or the loss of these key species is considered to be more dangerous and a more serious threat to the flight safety than the loss of the few rivets on the seats or the windows inside the plane. So the next question is that at how much speed we are losing these biodiversity. So the biological wealth of our planet has been declining rapidly, and the accusing finger is clearly pointing to human activity. Obviously, humans are one of the major culprits that, and the activities of the humans have actually lead to the decline in the biological wealth of our planet. And the colonization of the tropical Pacific islands by humans is said to have led to the extinction of more than 2,000 species of the native birds. So the human activities have shown or have resulted in the extinction of many species. This is just this is just a single example where the colonization of the tropical Pacific islands by humans is said to have led to the extinction of more than 2,000 species of the native birds. So IUCN Red List is the book, or we can say is the list that documents the extinct species. So IUCN Red List 2004 documents the extinction of 784 species, including 338 vertebrates, 359 invertebrates, and 87 plants in the last 500 years. So this is an alarming rate with which the plants, animals, and species and other species are becoming extinct. And some examples of recent extinctions include the dodo from Mauritius, quagga from Africa, thylacine in Australia, Steelers sea cow Russia, and three subspecies Bali Javan and Caspian of tiger. It is really, really important that these figures are really alarming, and it is really important to preserve, to prevent the loss of these biodiversity. As we see in the last slide also, that initially we might not realize that the loss in the biodiversity is actually leading to the threat to the ecosystem and to the human races. But in the long run, we will find that the loss in this biodiversity is, we might not realize that there might be a loss of certain keystone species that are actually driving the major functions in an ecosystem, and the loss of these species will actually lead to the collapse in the ecosystem, collapse of the ecosystem. So the last 20 years alone have witnessed the disappearance of 27 species, which is a very high figure. So careful analysis of records shows that the extinction across the taxa are not random, and some groups like amphibians appear to be more vulnerable to extinction. So adding to the grim scenario of extinctions is the fact that more than 15,500 species worldwide are actually facing the threat of extinction or are on the verge of extinction. And if these species are not protected, there will be a time that no sooner these species will become extinct, and we might not find a single organism of these species. Presently, 12% of all the bird species, 23% of all mammal species, 32% of all amphibian species, and 31% of all gymnosperm species in the world face the threat of extinction. So these are the alarming rates, and from the study of life on the earth through fossil records, we learn that large-scale loss of species like the one we are currently witnessing have also happened earlier, even before humans appeared on the scene. And during the long period, which is around more than 3 billion years since the origin and diversification of life on the earth, there were 5 episodes of mass extinction. And so is it the sixth extinction presently in progress? And if it is the sixth extinction, how is it different from the previous 5 extinctions or the previous 5 episodes of extinction? So the difference is in the rates. So even earlier also the extinction of the species have happened, even when the humans were not there. But these were the 5 episodes of extinction, and now we are facing the sixth episode of the extinction. The difference, however, in the sixth episode is in the rates. So the current species extinction rates are estimated to be 100 to 1,000 times faster than the ones in the pre-human times, and therefore suggesting or therefore pointing that our activities are responsible for the faster rate. Because we know that even in the pre-human era, where humans do not exist or human race were not there, extinctions do happen, but the extinction of the species in those era actually were at a smaller rate or at a slower rate as compared to the ones that are happening now due to the human interventions. So ecologists actually have warned that if the present trends continue, nearly half of all the species on the earth might be wiped out within the next 100 years, and therefore making the life difficult. So in general, the loss of biodiversity in a region may lead to the decline in the plant production, lowered resistance to environmental perturbations such as drought, and increased variability in a certain ecosystem process such as plant productivity, water use, and pest and disease cycles. So therefore, it is really important to maintain or to actually stop this loss of biodiversity. And with this, I would like to end today's session. And in the next lecture, we will learn about the factors that are actually responsible for the loss of these biodiversity, and the factors that or the steps that we can take to prevent this loss of biodiversity or to maintain the species diversity which is present in an ecosystem. So in the last lecture of biodiversity, which will be on the next Thursday, we'll learn about how we can, like, what are the factors that are responsible for the loss in the biodiversity and how we can maintain or how we can preserve this loss in the biodiversity through various actions. So with this, I would like to thank you all for attending to today's lecture. And the take-home message for today's lecture is that the biodiversity, the diversity or the species diversity is really important for the not only for the maintenance of the ecosystem or the healthy ecosystem, but also for the survival of the human race. And the rate at which the extinction is happening in our era where the humans exist and due to human activities, the rate have become faster. It is important to understand the importance of this biodiversity and its role in the humans for and its role and the role of these species diversity in maintaining the ecosystem or for the survival of human race, and therefore it becomes more important to maintain or to preserve the loss of these species by taking certain actions. So thank you all for attending today's lecture.